I grew up listening to the CBC, you know, it's just a part of my childhood. It was always on, you know, it was that voice kind of going in the background and, you know, that you could learn something from.
I'm 77 years old. I've lived with the CBC almost all my life.
I tune into the CBC daily, and to think that it might be threatened by cuts and eventually disappear one day, it's quite upsetting.
It's important to have a strong national public broadcaster because it defines who we are as a people and gives us a voice.
Represents a lot of multiculturalism.
Reflects, you know, the bones of the country, the heart of the country.
It's part of our culture, right? I mean, it's been part of Canada for so long.
Something that's wonderful about the CBC is, you know, I can call my parents in the Midwest and they've seen the same story and we can chat about that story and have that connection.
It is the only network, the only organization that brings this country together. East, west, north, south, there is nothing else.
Brilliant documentaries, unbiased reporting, which is so important now, especially now.
It's actually been an incubator of amazing local content that reflects the multiculturalism of our country.
I think it's terrible that Canada ranks at the bottom among Western democracies for its funding of its national public broadcaster.
I feel angry about the cuts and frustrated and despairing about the direction of our current federal government.
They're just crippling the CBC. And in the end, I don't know where it's going to go.
CBC is crucial, it is important, and it should be maintained, and it should be funded.
I would say that we're really losing a vital part of Canada by making these cuts to the CBC. I think it's incredibly important to safeguard our traditions and our culture.
And by stripping that away, you're really tearing at the fabric of what makes us such a special country.
Welcome to this live Friends of Canadian Broadcasting production from Ottawa. As a result of budget cuts, the future of our national public broadcaster, the CBC, has been very much on the public mind in recent months. And with a general election on the horizon, the parties are sharpening their political messages. With this in mind, we have invited the leaders of Canada's federal political parties with representation in the House of Commons to provide Canadians with their vision for CBC's future. First up is the Honourable Thomas Mulcair, leader of the official opposition and the New Democratic Party. I am very pleased to introduce the great Don Newman, who will host this session and interview Mr. Mulcair. Over to you, Don.
Thank you, Ian, and good evening, everybody, and welcome to the webcast. This is the first in the Leaders series, and Tom Mulcair, as you heard, is with us, and Mr. Mulcair, nice to see you again.
Thank
you for joining us this evening.
Here.
Really appreciate it. Let's talk CBC. Battered, bruised, bloodied, the staff that are still there, demoralized. You said, though, not too long ago, that if you are forming a government, that you would reinstate the $115 million that was cut most recently from the CBC. Tell me, though, in the priority of NDP promises, and I ask you this because the economic situation is deteriorating, we may not be in a surplus anymore, we may be in a deficit. Where does that stand in your promised priorities? Because I can't believe that you would refund the CBC, say, ahead of your $15 a day daycare.
Well, I have been a cabinet minister, and I know what it is to manage these tough issues day in and day out. But I also understand, Don, for having been in public life for over 35 years, that governing is about priorities. And for us, the CBC is just that, a top priority. So first in November, at a meeting of the Federation of Professional Journalists, and then more recently in January in Montreal, close to the CBC headquarters, we had occasion to lay out the details of our plan to roll back over the 3-year period that after forming government, the $115 million that the Conservatives cut over the last 3 years. Of course, it would be nice to be able to go even further back in time and remember that the Liberals cut over $350 million when they were in power the last time and to try to do something about that. But the reality is we're going to have to start somewhere. So this is a realistic amount, $115 million put back over a 3-year cycle and provide predictable funding, stable funding over several year period at a time so that there could be proper planning. That's also about good management, and it's something that's becoming increasingly difficult because CBC never knows from one year to the next how much is going to be there.
Well, tell us what predictable funding would look like. Would it be an increase over every year, or would it just be, we're going to give you so much for a number of years and that's it? Because, as you know, and I guess just about everybody does, but certainly you know, predictable funding, if it's the same every year, actually is going down in terms of purchasing power every year, and in fact, the CBC is losing ground that way.
No question. And as the remarks at the beginning pointed out, we're one of the few countries that has a public broadcaster that puts in so little. And if you look at the size of the country geographically, look at what has to be covered in terms of the scope historically, the language differences, bilingual country, bijuridical, and also multicultural in nature, we're trying to do a lot with less, and it's just not possible. We've hit the point now where there's been a critical mass of cuts to the CBC, which will make it impossible to do all the things we're asking it to do. It's the only institution that allows us to tell our stories to each other. I grew up in a bilingual family. I watched as much Don Messer's Jubilee as I would watch La Famille Plouffe. And we would sometimes fight over whether it would be René Le Cavalier or Danny Gallivan telling us Hockey Night in Canada. But that's part of being Canadian too. But it's also the ability to have news gathering that's sensitive to what's happening in the other language group or in the other community. If you're a Francophone outside Quebec, and it's interesting as I travel the country, how many Canadians in other provinces understand this, the importance to those minority French-speaking groups, whether they're in Saskatchewan or Manitoba or the Acadians in New Brunswick, that's a huge problem for them, and it's a particular problem because they've been taking an even greater hit. So all of us have to understand that this vital institution that helps us tell our own stories, to relay all the information about who we are and the future of this great country, depends on our ability to have a public broadcaster, and that future is in danger with the most recent cuts. So the $115 million for the first 3 years is enough to get us by, to start stabilizing things, and then we can start looking at a better formula to ensure its future.
Do you think, I mean, obviously the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting agree how important the CBC is, but do you think the Canadians still feel that it is as important as the people say at the beginning of this program were saying?
I have the good fortune, because of my job, to be able to travel constantly from coast to coast to coast, the only country with that fronts on 3 oceans, and I hear it everywhere. People are very worried about the future of the CBC. They really love their public broadcaster. They understand its importance. Those of us who are in my age group have grown up with the CBC, seen it become the institution that it is today. But we've got to get to the next level. So for example, as we're hitting the digital era where we're building new platforms, it's the worst time to be cutting back. Access to all the history of the CBC. Some of those cuts are going to affect our ability to know the history of our country as told through the CBC and those great archives that are there. So we're cutting back at the very worst time in some of the most crucial areas. At the same time, the Conservatives haven't been thoughtful. You know, they promised that there would be an open nomination process for important public appointments. It hasn't been the case. They've packed the board of directors with a lot of their friends, whether it's Conservative lawyers or Conservative donors or former Conservative candidates. I don't mind anybody's political party being represented if it's the best person, but instead of having Conservatives while the Conservatives are in power and a bunch of Liberals when the Liberals are in power, or a bunch of NDPers when we form a government, I want to have the best Canadians with the best understanding of the country and understanding of broadcasting. They're doing the best job possible for all of us, and that's something we would change. We'd find a neutral way of finding the best people for the job.
Well, that's interesting because, I mean, you would still at the end of the day appoint them. So how would you go about finding these perfect people, or at least not perfect, better than we have now?
Well, don't forget, it's something that Mr. Harper promised when he was in opposition. It was part of his ethics package. There was going to be an appointments commission, and he started setting up the infrastructure for that, which was all good. And then he wanted to put in one of his close friends on top of it. And we said, well, that's not necessarily the best way to stop partisan appointments. And he said, well, it's either my way or the highway, which is his way. And it was never put in place. So we'd make sure that we put in place a neutral commission for the types of appointments, starting with this type of appointment that's so important at CBC Radio-Canada.
And that would be for the president as well?
I think that would be the best way to go about finding the president. You don't keep it within the Prime Minister's office and have someone in there who's going to be put under incredible pressure. I mean, Hubert Lacroix is doing the best he can with what's given to him. He's working with the hand that was dealt to him. But at the same time, you've got to make sure that you've got people who are surrounding him who believe in the importance of public broadcasting. And honestly, Don, I don't think that's the case with the current board of directors at CBC Radio-Canada.
Well, would the Prime Minister still appoint the president of the CBC if you were Prime Minister or would the board? Because, I mean, it is a rather unusual situation where you have the President appointed and really only responsible to the Prime Minister, and then you have the Board of Directors, and sometimes you have a chairman who doesn't like the President, but he can't do anything about it, or she can't do anything about it except harass him because the Prime Minister has appointed the President, and the President is not responsible to the board.
Well, I think that would probably be the healthiest way of doing it. We would start with the most obvious and easiest first choice, which is to set up a system where we get the best people on the board of directors and either take their advice or take their appointment straight up. It would be quite easy to do it that way.
And how would you make sure, or can you make sure, that there wouldn't be political interference with the CBC? And how would you, do you feel that all political interference would be improper? And I ask you this as a Quebecer and as a Quebec Federalist, and I hearken back to the referendum of 1995, right, when RDI, which is RDE in French, was known as RDWE in Quebec, but also out of Quebec as well. Is there any time when political interference is justified when it would appear that the CBC is not meeting its mandate under the under the Broadcasting Act, which is to promote national unity?
Well, actually, it says that it has to promote a national identity, and the national unity side is no longer specifically mentioned. But what's also important...
But the national identity is what the country is now, not less.
But I think that the answer to your question is no. And the fact that Quebec was so evenly split in '95, if we had a public broadcaster who wasn't reflecting that, people might have been lulled into a sense of false security. So having that openness and honesty and saying, this is how divided it is. We've got people here who are working, who are clearly identifying with one side and others with the other side. It wasn't a foregone conclusion. In fact, it was such a close-run thing, we'd never want to go through it again. But that simply begs the question, why would we be dismantling one of the few things in the country that allows francophones in minority situations in other provinces and anglophones in Quebec, that allows us to tell each other our own stories, that allows people to, working in close proximity in one institution, to know the news of the other and become familiar with it and relay it to the whole country? Why in heaven's name would we, of all times, be dismantling that now? More than ever, with everything that comes in through all sorts of other fora, like the internet and other sources of information now, it's becoming increasingly difficult to have that identity as Canadians. We are bilingual, we are bicultural, we are multicultural. Let's keep working on that together and identifying ourselves.
Would you accept if a president of the CBC were appointed the way you think it should be done, would you accept a president of the CBC that essentially argued back with government? Because it seems to me that the last president that argued back was Pierre Junot, and after that the term was shortened from 7 years to 5 years, so the prime ministers had more control over presidents, and we haven't had one fight back since. And in fact, with Mr. Lacroix, who you say is doing the best he can, Mr. Harper seems to think so because he reappointed him, and that's a very unusual thing to happen for a president too. So, but we don't hear many presidents of the CBC in the last 20 years complaining about cutbacks, really.
Well, I think that that's something that you would expect from a board that would be autonomous, independent, and credible. And under the appointments process that we're talking about, we'd have that type of person. And before being elected the first time, I was the head, the president of a large regulatory agency, and I can tell you, I'm used to being that person who does stand up to the authority of a minister or a government, because it was in my mandate to ensure the public protection, and I stood up on important issues of principle. So I'm familiar with that, and I'm not at all worried about putting someone in place who would stand up to us if we weren't respecting the mandate and the fundamental role of CBC Radio-Canada. And by the way, I know you'd hold me to that, and I wouldn't be worried about it.
All right. I'd only hold you to it as a journalist, though, not as a member of the board or president of the CBC, believe me. Now, we've asked people around the country to send in questions, so let's put some of those questions up and let's talk about them. And the first is, if you do reinstate the $115 million for the CBC, would you also release a vision of what you believe the CBC should look like over the next 20 years? What its mandate should be? Or perhaps even have a national discussion on what Canadians want out of a public broadcaster. So would you encourage that debate, and would you put maybe a white paper or something like that?
I love the aspect of the debate, and I love the part about asking Canadians. With regard to anyone's ability to predict today what it would look like in 20 years, that's a degree of temerity that even I don't hold, for the good and simple reason that who could have predicted that we'd be in this position today? You know, the cuts, the 350 million in cuts under the Liberals, the now 115 under the Conservatives, endangering the ability of the CBC to continue to keep up. Because whether it was 50 years ago going to colored TV or today building those electronic digital platforms that will allow us to compete around the world with the best of the best, if we're not giving them the money to do it, they're not going to be able to. So let's make sure that we're up to date now. Let's get that pluriannual funding in immediately, get the money back that was just recently cut over the same 3-year period, and let's start sitting down with a board that will give us their plan for the CBC within its existing mandate, and by all means consult with Canadians on how that mandate has to evolve in and of itself.
But would you put out a white paper, maybe not to cover the next 20 years, I take your point on that, but for the next 5 years, I mean, it seems to me if you're going to have a national discussion, there has to be some kind of a document which at least frames the discussion to some degree.
Well, I'm a man of action. And I firmly believe that the first thing to do is to act on a situation that's become critical. First thing I would do would be to put back the money for the 3-year period in question. During that time, of course, we could sit down either in Parliament through a parliamentary committee. I would prefer it as a technique I've used before to go across the country and hold hearings on a rotating basis in various cities and towns across the country, hear from Canadians on that, and develop a plan from that instead of trying to do it from the top down. The same way you want to have a board of directors that is representative and that you leave independent, you don't make those decisions for them. Let's ask Canadians how they see their own public broadcaster evolving. That would be my approach.
Okay, let's take another question. Will the NDP implement a license fee system of funding the CBC as used in Britain to finance the BBC?
That's not part of our plan. The way we've been doing it in Canada right now is the way we would continue, and it would be a direct grant, and it would be monies from and out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund. Anytime in public administration you want to emulate someone else's system because it seems to be working there, we tend to forget that it evolved there and it has its own circuit that got it there. If you try to simply copy somebody else's way of doing it, it doesn't necessarily work out for you. In Canada, we've been doing it that way. What's missing is the money, not a new structure. Let's give them the money, and then we can work on the rest of it after.
Well, then how do you feel about commercials on the CBC? Because I think it was Richard Stursberg, when he was Executive Vice President, he said the CBC is now both a public but also a private broadcaster, and it needs to find audiences the way a private broadcaster does, so it can sell advertising and sell it at rates that bring in enough money to keep the place going. So how do you feel about ads on CBC television, but also on radio, where they're starting to just creep back in a bit on radio too?
Well, like anyone who loves the CBC, I would certainly prefer to see fewer ads than are there now. But I think we also have to understand that that's the reality that we're in today. Providing the funding might at least stem the tide of allowing more in with regard to television. On the radio side, I think that we should really hold the anchor tight. I think that it's a great thing that we've got such high quality radio that we can listen to without the interruptions from advertising, and we're also not competing with the private market for those advertising dollars, which is another form of pressure on the other sector that sometimes makes private broadcasters look askance at the public broadcaster. So I would try to keep that airtight.
So you would get rid of the ads that are, I mean, there are not very many. They haven't been very successful with it, but because I guess a lot of people agree with you. But the fact is there are occasionally ads on radio too. Would you get rid of them?
I would definitely make sure we kept CBC Radio free of ads.
All right. A viewer in Montreal asks, we have seen how the CBC has been forced to destroy itself through budget cutting, eliminating creative staff, and heritage resources such as the costume library. Does the NDP feel such damage can be reversed, and if so, how?
We're losing a lot, and that was a good summary of it, because every time you see a reference to the fact that the most recent cuts have resulted in 650 jobs lost, we forget about the fact that that's 650 families who have lost their livelihood. But more often than not, you're dealing with the younger people who are the ones who master the techniques, especially in the digital age, that could have brought us to the next phase. So we're losing incredible ability and the ability to keep CBC Radio Canada going. The costumier, that you were just referring to, is an incredible physical loss of generations of physical property that represents all that heritage. And that's an incredible loss. It's unacceptable to us. It's such an incredible shame that nothing more has been done to save it, but we do know that the types of monies that we're talking about would allow us to save it. But in the meantime, something has to be done. There are private groups working on that now to do everything they can to physically save that costume shop from and its contents.
As much as it can, but in a lot of the things, and the jobs as well, in a way, isn't it a bit like, and I don't say this is your fault or anybody's fault at the CBC, but it's sort of like locking the barn door after the horse has gone out?
Well, it hasn't been lost yet. So it's physically still there, the property. And so what people have to understand is that this is literally decades and decades and decades of material, of costumes, of properties, of props from the CBC. And it represents an incredible richness of who we are and what's been on the CBC. And to allow that to simply be lost would for us be totally unacceptable.
Another question for you from a viewer in Montreal. In his book, Ici était Radio-Canada, Alain Saulnier has documented many instances, well, he's complained and shown how political interference in Radio-Canada at the hands of different governments over the years has occurred. And what would you do to protect Radio-Canada CBC from political interference? We kind of talked about this a minute ago, but...
Well, Mr. Saulnier was with us in Saint-Sauveur at this meeting of the Federation of Professional Journalists in November, and he was exposing just that. He was talking in detail about his book and what he had seen up front. Well, I guess what you have to have is people who are strong enough to represent the public interest on this and not allow themselves to be pushed around. And if that is indeed happening, it's not something that I would ever accept in an NDP government, and I would make sure that the ability to speak is in place and that people would be free to let anyone know if there was being political interference. The strongest guarantee against political interference is a strong, willful, competent board of directors. If you put in a bunch of bagmen and party hacks from your political formation, and they're just there to attend meetings and do your will, they're not going to be able to stand up to anything, will they?
They don't seem to be all that interested, I don't think. But anyway, that's my point, not yours, and I'm not putting words in your mouth. Let me ask you a question that came from Winnipeg. Under financial pressure, the CBC has abandoned public service values and many audiences, such as seniors. Since each one of us pays for the CBC, what would you do to make sure that public service values guide CBC's management, and how would you fund the CBC to ensure it serves all Canadians? I think you've talked about the funding. This is really a question of how important are ratings, particularly in the television side of it. If people aren't watching, then they're not all that interested in supporting, I would say to you. But at the same time, a lot of things that the CBC used to do and only the CBC did, they don't seem to be doing anymore.
Exactly. And if the only answer, interestingly enough, from Winnipeg, because Shelley Glover's riding a St. Boniface in Manitoba, it's the only answer she's capable of giving in the House, is ratings. But it tends to make us forget the very reason that CBC is there, is to be able to tell the Canadian stories, to tell ourselves who we are, define us, do things that nobody else is going to do. And that's the very essence of a public broadcaster. So a lot of that has been lost. The Conservatives use it as a further excuse to continue the vicious cycle. Well, this is where you are in terms of ratings. We'll cut you even further. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy. They lose even more viewers. So we've got to stem that and get back to a situation where there is predictable funding. And the start for us is to put back what the Conservatives have cut.
So predictable funding, would you also try, when you could, to make up for some of the money that Hockey Night in Canada used to bring to the CBC?
Yeah, and it's a shame that it was lost, because it was such an identifying thing.
And it was one place where the country came together on Saturday night.
Absolutely, and watched the Montreal Canadiens win week after week. It was just great.
Where's your riding? Oh, yes, Montreal, yes.
But no, all kidding aside, it was such a great unifying factor. And it's an incredible thing that it was lost so easily. But when the money simply wasn't there, the private market was able to take it away. And it's a real shame. It's a great loss.
Now, here's a question that came from Dundas, Ontario. And it's a bit of a ball right over the center of the plate for you, because you have all those ridings in Hamilton. But the people of Hamilton, this question says, still have no local CBC service beyond a small and inadequate website. Would local CBC service be a priority for your government?
Local CBC service is a priority for the NDP for the good and simple reason is that's the heart of what's specific about the mandate. If you read the mandate of CBC, local stories, local broadcasting, something that nobody else can pick up, giving those stories across the country. You know, if you're in the French-speaking part of New Brunswick, maybe a local train is the most important thing. If it doesn't make it onto the newscast in Montreal, your story's not being told. Same thing in Hamilton. If your story, which is only an hour outside of Toronto, if it doesn't make it onto the Toronto News, maybe nobody in the government's going to understand to make it a priority. So you absolutely have to be able to tell that. From there to decide whether or not there's actually going to be a separate station, I think that that's a leap that I'm not ready to make right now, but I would be willing to say that the type of money that we'd be putting back in would allow those local stories to continue to be told.
What do you think will be the CBC as an election issue? Do you think that people will bring it up, or do you think that, I mean, I suppose you'll mention it, but do you think that people will have it on the tip of tongue, front of mind when they're voting?
It is a top-of-mind issue right now. Across the country, from coast to coast to coast, people are talking to us about it. Every stop that I go across the country, people are worried about the CBC, and they're also worried about the intentions of the Conservatives. The only thing that I get to see, Don, for being elected in the House of Commons is I'm not restricted to the one scene that's being shown on TV. I get to watch their behavior during question period. And anytime we ask a question about CBC funding, the hoots and hollers from the backbenches shows that a lot of this is about Conservative reaction against CBC. They don't like what they're hearing at CBC. They don't like the CBC. And we're going to do everything we can for a lot of reasons to make sure the Conservatives don't get back into power, but I would be very fearful for the future of the CBC at all in our country if ever they got back in.
And do you think if they do get back in, and it's a majority government again, that the CBC won't be here by the end of that mandate?
It would definitely be on the chopping block completely. This is a very Manichaean view. This is a Republican view. It's a pure theory of private markets that completely forgets about all of the reasons that make Canada a special place compared to the U.S. So if you're looking at a purely market-based analysis, you're saying, why are you spending public money on broadcasting? Let private companies do that. But they're not going to be able to do the job that the CBC was set up to do, and that it was always doing for all Canadians, whatever language group they're in, whatever region of the country they're in. That's what we're forgetting here. And so, sure, private broadcasters have their role, and they have to have you know, the ability to make money and to produce shows and to fulfill their mandates that the CRTC sets down. But the CBC in and of itself is in danger right now because we have hit that wall. It is a critical mass of cuts, and it's the very ability to go to the next level over the next few years to follow the new technologies that is currently on the table, and that's what I'm so worried about.
And in 30 seconds, do you think the CBC at the moment is doing a good enough job defending itself and making that point, or do you think it can't really make that?
I think that the people who have been hand-chosen by the Prime Minister's office to be the board of directors of the CBC.
No, but the people that work at the CBC.
Well, the people who work at the CBC do what they can, but they're employees, and it's very difficult for them to do it. So someone like Mr. Saunier, once he's left, can make that point, but it's very hard to do it when you still have your employer looking right over you. Some of them have done it, by the way, and very courageously gone on different news shows and complained publicly. And there are also people who are being reeled in, so. It's not very fair. That's the reality of it.
Time is gone, Tom Mulcair, but thank you for giving us your time now. Good to see you again.
Take good care.
Well, that is all the time, as I say, we have for this evening, so thank you very much for joining us as well. And when you say goodnight tonight, remember, we'll be back soon with the next installment of the Leaders series about the CBC, and we hope to see you then. Good night.